In 1930, a brand new Packard automobile cost $2,385. That's the equivalent of over $43,000 in today's money. And wealthy Americans lined up to buy them. Presidents drove them. Generals commanded motorcades in them. Hollywood royalty arrived at premieres in them. At its peak, Packard was not just a car company. It was a statement. It was the answer to a single unspoken question. Have you made it? The factory where those cars were made was a 3.5 million square foot complex that took up 40 acres of Detroit's East Grand Boulevard. It was once the most advanced factory in the world. At its peak, it had more than 40,000 workers who were skilled in more than 80 different trades. It was a city within a city. It was the center of American luxury manufacturing. That factory is quiet now. The windows are broken, the ceilings have fallen down, the floorboards are covered in trees, rust forms on the steel, the concrete breaks apart, and the city of Detroit recently spent an estimated $15 to $20 million just to begin demolishing what's left of it. Not to restore it, not to save it, but simply to tear it down so it stops being a public hazard. Gone. Disappeared. Over. So how does a company that was once more prestigious than Cadillac, that survived 2 world wars, that clothed American presidents and powered P-51 Mustang fighter planes, how does a company like that vanish from the face of the earth in less than a decade? How does the greatest luxury car brand in American history go from manufacturing 40,000 cars a year to producing literally 0, and doing it so quietly that most people today don't even know it happened? And here's the part people rarely mention. Packard didn't fall apart because the cars were bad. In fact, they were excellent. It didn't disappear simply because of poor leadership either, at least not by itself. But the reality was much darker. Packard was undone by the same forces that have ruined empires, famous brands, and powerful families throughout history. A slow loss of identity, the pressure and fear of competition, and one critical mistake, choosing the wrong partner to rely on. If you're ready to see what really happened, let's begin. Now, let's look at where this empire was actually born. It starts not in Detroit, but in Warren, Ohio, a small industrial town where a mechanical engineer named James Ward Packard was having a very bad day. The year was 1898. Packard had just purchased one of the finest automobiles available in America, a Winton, from a man named Alexander Winton, one of the most successful car manufacturers in the country. The car broke down almost immediately. Packard went back to Winton with detailed suggestions for improvement. Winton was not interested. His exact reply, according to historical accounts, was essentially, "If you think you can do better, go build your own car." James Ward Packard took that as a job. In just 6 months, the first Packard car hit the streets of Warren, Ohio. It was built in a corner of his family's manufacturing warehouse by a small group of mechanics. It was November 6th, 1899. Packard made cars. The philosophy was clear from the first model: not cheap, not quick, not showy in a rude way, exactly designed, very dependable, not sorry for being luxurious. Even in the beginning, the Packard brand was too expensive for most people to buy. The Oldsmobile Runabout was a popular car that cost $650. Packard cars, on the other hand, started at $2,600, which was almost 4 times as much. This was not a mistake. This was a statement of who they were. By 1902, Packard had attracted serious money. A Detroit businessman named Henry Bourne Joy, a member of one of Detroit's oldest and wealthiest families, purchased a Packard, was immediately impressed by its engineering, and invested heavily in the company. Joy and a group of investors formally reorganized the company as the Packard Motor Car Company on October 2, 1902. And then they did the smartest thing they could have done. They moved operations to Detroit, where the entire American automobile supply chain was rapidly concentrating. But that wasn't the whole story of what happened next. What really happened was in 1903. Henry Joy hired an architect named Albert Kahn to design a new factory on 40 acres of land along East Grand Boulevard. Kahn was a Jewish immigrant from Germany who had built his practice in Detroit. At the time, no one knew that this one job would change the course of American industrial architecture forever, Albert Kahn was about to come up with the idea for the modern factory. The factory that changed everything. The first 9 buildings Kahn designed for Packard were conventional. Brick and timber construction, low ceilings, small windows, cramped working spaces, standard for the era. But building number 10 was different. Kahn, working with his brother Julius, who had developed a revolutionary patented system for reinforcing concrete with steel, created something the industrial world had never seen. Building 10 of the Packard complex, completed in 1906, was the first reinforced concrete factory building in the Detroit automobile industry. The walls appeared to be almost entirely made of glass. Natural light flooded the massive interior. The spans between support columns were enormous, 32 feet by 64 feet, allowing for large open production floors that could accommodate any layout, any machine, any assembly line configuration. Workers could see, workers could breathe, workers could move. The effect on productivity was immediate and striking. Other factory buildings were quickly torn down and rebuilt using the same design. By 1907, the Kahn truss bar system had already been used in more than 1,500 buildings across the United States. Ford brought Kahn in to build the Highland Park plant, the place where the moving assembly line first appeared. Chrysler hired him too. General Motors followed. The entire design of American industrial factories was changed for good. And it all began with a Packard factory built on a 40-acre site in Detroit. Here's the part most people never mention. The Packard plant was more than just a place where cars were made. It represented the company's identity. The administration building was designed to match the elegance of the automobiles produced inside. The entrance had Tuscan columns with the word Packard carved directly into the stone. Company leaders even had their homes designed by Kahn's firm. The proving grounds, built on 560 acres of farmland north of Detroit in the late 1920s, looked like a country estate with Tudor Revival buildings and iron gates, because Packard knew its customers weren't only buying cars, they were buying a whole lifestyle. But worse was coming for those who didn't understand what that world was actually built on. So what was Packard actually like at its peak? By the early 1920s, Packard was not competing with Ford or Chevrolet. It was competing with Rolls-Royce and European coach builders. It was producing cars for the Tsar of Russia, for Woodrow Wilson, for Warren Harding. The phrase, "Ask the man who owns one," Packard's advertising slogan, possibly the most confident car advertisement ever written, required no features list, no price comparison, no technical specifications. It said simply, if you need to ask, you can't afford it. If you can afford it, you already know. In 1915, Packard Motor Car Company introduced the Twin Six, the first 12-cylinder engine ever put into production in the United States. In 1916, Packard Motor Car Company supplied Tsar Nicholas II of Russia with Twin Six touring cars. In 1920, Packard Motor Car Company introduced the first air-conditioned passenger car, which, while decades ahead of its time, would be seen as cutting-edge technology. In 1923, Packard Motor Car Company introduced one of the first V12 engines ever put into production. The engineers at Packard Motor Car Company were also instrumental in the development of the Liberty L-12 engine, which powered Allied aircraft during World War I, technology which would be used to produce the Packard Merlin 512, the engine which powered the legendary North American P-51 Mustang fighter aircraft during World War II. The Packard factory grew continuously to meet the demand for its products. By 1908, just 5 years after the factory had been opened, the factory had already grown 6 times its original size. New buildings were being constructed continuously. By 1910, the last of the original buildings had been torn down and replaced with reinforced concrete. The complex had grown to include 80 buildings on 80 acres, connected with internal bridges, including the famous decorative bridge over Grand Boulevard, which carried completed car bodies over the street on the assembly line. The workers inside were not anonymous laborers on a conveyor belt. They were craftsmen, machinists, leather workers, coach builders, electrical engineers, finishers, upholsterers, and painters. The plant had its own brass band, its own baseball team, its own hospital and fire department. When a 1907 model was completed ahead of schedule, workers decorated it with flags and drove it through the streets of Detroit in celebration. When an experimental model returned from a road test, workers from across the entire factory gathered to inspect it, ask questions, and offer improvements. This was a culture of pride, precision, and excellence, and it showed in every automobile that left the factory. At the peak of the 1920s, boom, Packard was producing cars at a rate and quality that no American manufacturer could match in the luxury segment. The company was financially healthy, its reputation was globally supreme, and its factory was a national landmark. If you were wealthy in America in 1928, you drove a Packard. Period. And then October 1929 arrived. So when did Packard really seal its own fate? The stock market crash in October 1929 was devastating for luxury products. When the Great Depression began, wealthy Americans didn't just spend less, many tried to hide their wealth, showing up to a business meeting in a $4,000 Packard worth more than $70,000 today, while jobless men stood in long lines outside could damage your reputation. Sales of luxury cars across the industry fell sharply. Packard sales dropped from around 50,000 cars in 1928 to only about 6,000 by 1932. The decline was severe. Packard was forced to make a difficult decision: keep its exclusivity and risk going bankrupt as the market for $4,000 cars nearly vanished, or release more affordable models to attract middle-class buyers who still had jobs and still wanted the status of owning a Packard, even if it came at a much lower price. They chose the second option. In 1935, Packard introduced the Packard 120, a completely new, smaller, more affordable automobile priced at just $980, about $22,000 today. The car sold brilliantly. In 1935 alone, Packard sold over 24,000 units of the new 120 model, more than 4 times its total output from 1932. The company was saved, the financial crisis was resolved, production volumes soared, workers kept their jobs. But the real problem came next. The wealthy buyers whose buying habits had been the defining characteristic of the Packard brand did not simply stop buying the lower-priced Packards, they stopped buying any Packard. Because suddenly, the dentist down the street drove a Packard. Suddenly, the insurance agent down the street drove a Packard. Suddenly, the car that had said, "I've arrived," said, "I want to arrive." But in the world of luxury products, the difference between those two statements is not trivial. It's death by 1,000 cuts. The Packard brass knew this intellectually. They created separate naming schemes, separate dealer networks, and tried their best to preserve the illusion that the luxury Packard and the affordable Packard were two utterly separate products. They didn't work. Because the American consumer, no matter how clever the marketer, knows one thing: a Packard is a Packard, and when the Packard logo appears on an automobile priced at $980, the Packard logo on the Packard priced at $4,000 has lost something, some intangible quality, some magic, some mystique, which cannot be replaced. The real reason Packard failed wasn't the Great Depression. That was the decision they made to survive the Great Depression. By the late 1930s, Packard was producing vast volumes of its cheaper models and relatively small numbers of its prestige cars. The production volumes looked healthy on paper. The financial statements showed profit. But the brand, the invisible architecture of exclusivity that supported everything Packard stood for, that was eroding with every single 120 series car that rolled off the factory floor. Then World War II began, and for a while the problem was put on hold. The Packard factory switched to wartime production, most notably building the Packard-made Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 engine used in the P-51 Mustang fighter plane. Packard produced 55,523 of these engines under license from Rolls-Royce. The factory became a key part of the Allied war effort. Workers were creating something truly impressive. But when the war ended and Packard went back to building cars, the world it returned to was completely different. But after the war, Packard was facing a problem it couldn't easily solve. After World War II, the American automobile industry entered a period of extraordinary growth. But the growth was not distributed equally. It was concentrated, ferociously and structurally, around 3 companies: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, the Big Three. These companies had advantages that were not just financial, they were architectural. GM had Chevrolet for the mass market, Buick for the upper middle, Oldsmobile as a step above that, Cadillac at the top. An American car buyer could enter the GM ecosystem as a young person buying a $1,200 Chevy, and, as they climbed the economic ladder through their career, graduate upward through Buick, Oldsmobile, and finally Cadillac, never leaving the GM family. Every dollar spent was captured within the same corporate structure. Packard had no ecosystem. Packard had many models at many price points, but no model ladder, no way to start at the bottom and work your way up. But perhaps most important, Packard had no volume. Packard's best year in terms of production came after the war. They were making 90,000 cars annually. Cadillac, on the other hand, was making over 100,000. General Motors in total was making millions. The math of the auto industry in 1950 was simple. The more cars you made, the lower your cost, the higher your margin, the more you could invest in product development. Packard, on the other hand, had created a death spiral. But the best part of the Packard story is that even at the end, Packard still had good products. They had good engineers, good designers, and good craftsmen. But Cadillac, with the resources of General Motors, had introduced its first overhead valve V8 engine in 1949. Oldsmobile had won the same year. Packard, handicapped and unable to compete, had stuck with its straight 8 engine, an engine technology from the 1930s well into the 1950s. When Packard finally introduced its V8 engine in 1955, Cadillac and Oldsmobile had been making overhead valve V8s for 6 years. 6 years in the auto industry is like 6 decades. Packard had finally arrived at the future, only to find that everyone had already moved in, the boxes were already unpacked, and the decorations were already up. And then came the body supplier catastrophe. Before the war, Packard had outsourced its body manufacturing to Briggs Manufacturing Company to reduce costs. The savings were minimal. Briggs charged more than anticipated, but Packard had committed to the arrangement. Then, in 1952, Chrysler purchased Briggs Manufacturing. The agreement was that Packard would continue to receive bodies through 1954. And then the supply would end. Packard now faced the staggering cost of rebuilding its entire body manufacturing capability, while simultaneously trying to develop new car models and fight a war on 2 fronts against the Big Three. Wait a minute, let's be clear about what was happening. By 1953, Packard needed a new body manufacturing facility, a new V8 engine, a complete redesign of its product lineup, a modern factory to replace its aging East Grand Boulevard complex, and enough capital to sustain operations during the multi-year development period required to deliver all of the above. The company had none of these things in sufficient quantity. What it did have was a reputation, a brand name, a loyal customer base, and a decision to make about its future. The board chose a merger. And that choice was the end of everything. Then Packard made the decision that changed everything. On October 1st, 1954, the Packard Motor Car Company officially merged with the Studebaker Corporation to form the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. Packard's president, James Nance, a former Hot Point appliance executive with enormous energy and ambition but no prior automotive experience, had structured the deal as a Packard purchase of Studebaker. On paper, Packard was the acquirer. In reality, Packard had just swallowed a hand grenade. Here is what Nance and the Packard board didn't fully realize when they signed the merger deal. Studebaker was in far worse financial shape than anyone had admitted. Its factories were old and outdated. The union workforce had secured wage and work agreements so generous that the company needed to build around 250,000 to 300,000 cars a year just to break even. But in the years before the merger, Studebaker had only been producing about 100,000 to 150,000 cars. The company was essentially bankrupt in structure. It was losing money on every vehicle because its costs were built for a level of production it could no longer reach. In the spring of 1954, while the merger talks were still happening, Studebaker's own internal estimates showed the company was heading toward losses of nearly $39 million before taxes for that year alone. The Packard board, convinced by the investment bank Lehman Brothers' optimistic forecast of $15.6 million in yearly savings from the merger, never asked for an independent audit of Studebaker's finances. They didn't check the numbers. They trusted what they were told, and they were told exactly what they wanted to hear. The merger was approved, the deal was done, and within weeks, reality arrived. The Studebaker-Packard Corporation recorded a net loss of $26,178,315 in its very first year of existence, and that was just the beginning. Losses would continue to mount. The combined company, rather than becoming stronger than either of its parts, had become a single entity carrying the combined weight of both companies' problems. As Roy Hurley of Curtiss-Wright later described it with brutal honesty, two drunks leaning on each other for support. The financial figures continued to cascade into disaster. Sales volume dropped to 129,000 in 1956 from 198,000 in 1955. Bank loans were rising towards $55 million. Stock values were reduced by around 80% of pre-merger levels. Total losses between 1954 and 1956 came in at over $100 million, or around $1.1 billion in today's dollars. They tried to keep tooling for Studebaker and Packard as separate identities. This cost around $15 million for the 1956 model facelift alone. It was financial hemorrhage masquerading as business strategy. Nance, to his credit, understood the extent of the disaster. He had believed in the merger all along. Now, however, he realized that the figures were no longer in dispute. In October 1956, he resigned as president of Studebaker-Packard and went to work for Ford Motor Company. With his resignation, the last believer in Packard within Studebaker-Packard was gone. What was left was a company that was focused solely on survival, and survival, it was determined, meant giving up Packard. The Packard Baker, the final humiliation. In late 1956, Curtiss-Wright Corporation, an aviation conglomerate that supplied emergency operating capital, took effective control of Studebaker-Packard. Curtiss-Wright immediately moved all remaining Packard production from Detroit to Studebaker's South Bend, Indiana plant. The East Grand Boulevard factory was shut down. 11,000 workers were idled, and the cars that wore the Packard badge in 1957 and 1958 were not Packards at all. They were Studebakers with Packard front clips and Packard interiors. Industry observers and consumers immediately called them Packard Bakers. The mockery was complete. Consumer Reports reviewed the 1957 models and reported that they were poorly built and difficult to drive. The cars sold in negligible numbers. On July 25, 1958, the final Packard automobile rolled off the South Bend assembly line. It was not a ceremony. There was no celebration, no tribute, no final procession of craftsmen watching their creation depart. There was simply a car, and then nothing. And then it was simply gone. But this part is often ignored. The standard narrative of Packard's decline goes like this. Great Depression forced cheaper models, brand was diluted, Studebaker merger was bad, company died. That narrative is not wrong, but it is radically incomplete. There are structural, systemic, and strategic failures in the Packard story that illuminate something much larger than one company's collapse, and they are almost never discussed. Reason 1. Packard failed to understand that luxury is not a product, it is a social system. When Packard introduced the 120 series in 1935, management believed they were simply making a practical move to survive the economic crisis. In reality, they were slowly taking apart the very structure that made Packard valuable. Luxury brands exist because they are rare. That rarity isn't accidental. It's the heart of the product. When a brand lowers that rarity to fix a sales problem, it may solve the short-term crisis, but create a much bigger problem later. The Packard 120 kept the company alive during the 1930s, but it also set the stage for its collapse in the 1950s. This isn't just hindsight, It's a basic rule of luxury economics, and Packard's leaders, skilled engineers and experienced businessmen, simply didn't fully understand it. Reason 2. The defense contract disaster that history has mostly forgotten. After World War II, the Secretary of Defense under President Eisenhower was Charles Wilson, who had previously been the CEO of General Motors. During his time in office, many major defense contracts that Packard competed for and was capable of winning were given to General Motors and other Big Three companies instead. This wasn't just tough competition. Packard had developed strong defense manufacturing abilities during the war, and those facilities depended on government contracts afterward to stay active. But the contracts went somewhere else. The money that might have helped Packard modernize and survive was effectively directed to its biggest competitor. Strangely, this part of the story is rarely mentioned when people talk about Packard's decline. Reason 3. The body supplier crisis was a strategic assassination that nobody planned, but everyone should have prevented. When Chrysler purchased Briggs Manufacturing in 1952 and agreed to supply Packard bodies only through 1954, Packard was left with a 2-year window to rebuild its entire body manufacturing infrastructure. This was not a secret. Packard's management knew in 1952 exactly what was coming in 1954. And yet the company did not use those 2 years effectively to either build new body manufacturing capabilities or negotiate an alternative supply arrangement. The result was that the critical 1955 model year, the year Packard had to deliver new, compelling cars to survive, was produced at a different facility, the cramped Connor Avenue plant, with massive quality control problems. Buyers who were being asked to recommit to Packard in 1955 received cars with body fit issues, quality defects, and manufacturing problems from day one. The moment of recovery became the moment of final disenchantment. Reason 4. The Packard board was governed by men who were 20 years behind the competitive landscape. When James Nance arrived at Packard in 1952, the board of directors was composed primarily of men in their 70s who had run the company successfully through the 1920s and 1930s using strategies appropriate to that era. They had built an extraordinary institution, but the post-war American automobile industry was no longer the pre-war American automobile industry. It was a capital-intensive, design-driven, volume-dependent business that rewarded massive investment in modern manufacturing and penalized the incremental conservative approach that had served Packard for decades. The board's instincts, refined over decades of success, were precisely wrong for the competitive environment of 1952 through 1956. Reason. 5. Packard chose the wrong merger partner and ignored the evidence that told them so. At the time, Packard was negotiating with Studebaker. George Mason, the president of Nash Kelvinator, was simultaneously proposing a 4-way merger that would have combined Nash, Hudson, Studebaker, and Packard into a single major corporation capable of challenging Chrysler for third place among American automakers. Mason's plan had genuine strategic logic. The 4-way combination, while complex, had complementary product lines and the scale that all 4 companies individually lacked. Packard's board rejected Mason's proposal outright, refusing even to hear his presentation, because they preferred Studebaker's larger dealer network and apparently higher sales volume. Mason died of acute pancreatitis in October 1954, 1 week after the Studebaker-Packard merger was finalized. The alternative future died with him. Reason 6. The myth of the Packard brand's indestructibility blinded its management to the speed of its actual deterioration. Packard had been one of the most trusted and prestigious brands in American commerce for 50 years. That longevity created a form of institutional blindness. Management consistently overestimated the brand's resilience and underestimated how quickly consumer perception was changing. By the early 1950s, surveys of wealthy American car buyers showed that Packard was no longer automatically associated with the very pinnacle of luxury. Cadillac had taken that position while Packard was busy navigating the Depression and the war. But Packard's marketing and strategy continued to behave as though the pre-war brand reputation was fully intact. It was not. The fortress had been quietly deteriorating for 20 years, and from the inside, nobody had noticed because the walls still looked the same. Reason: 7. The American government saved Detroit's Big Three and left Packard to die, and this structural favoritism is never discussed. During and after World War II, the federal government's relationship with the automobile industry was not neutral. The massive wartime production contracts, the post-war defense procurement decisions, and the highway construction programs that followed, all of these policy choices disproportionately benefited companies with the scale and political connectivity to influence procurement decisions. Packard won the Merlin engine contract during the war based on genuine engineering excellence. But when the post-war economic landscape was being shaped, the company that built P-51 engines found itself locked out of the defense spending that could have funded its modernization. The structural advantages given to companies with insider connections to the post-war defense establishment were not available to Packard, and that invisible disadvantage compounded every other problem the company faced. Now let's look at what happened to the cathedral after the congregation left. When Packard stopped producing in 1956, it left behind 3.5 million square feet of industrial space. The structures, constructed of reinforced concrete by Albert Kahn and meant to last hundreds of years, were in sound structural condition. For a brief time, various businesses rented space in the complex and utilized it for manufacturing and storage. The Motor City Industrial Park utilized this space throughout the 1990s. Without a unifying owner and without investment, however, this space slowly disintegrated. In 1994, the city of Detroit claimed most of this space when the former owners failed to pay back taxes. This is when institutional abandonment occurred. Once the city of Detroit became a reluctant owner of 3.5 million square feet of space, it never left a bureaucratic limbo that it would never escape. Plans were proposed and failed. Developers were announced and never appeared. In 2013, a Peruvian developer, Fernando Palazuelo, bought a majority of the Packard site for $405,000. It is one of the most historically significant industrial sites in American history and sold for less than a house in a suburban neighborhood. He had announced that he would invest $350 million over 15 years to develop this site into a business and residential area. He never did. What happened inside the abandoned building during these decades was a different kind of history. Graffiti artists from around the world came to work on the massive concrete canvases. Urban explorers documented the decay. In the 1990s, the factory's enormous echo-filled spaces hosted underground rave parties that became part of Detroit's legendary electronic music history. In one notorious incident in 2009, a group of visitors pushed a dump truck through an opening in the fourth floor. By the early 2000s, scrappers had removed virtually every piece of wiring, metal fixture, and salvageable material from the interior, leaving only the naked concrete structure. On January 23, 2019, the famous decorative bridge that had carried Packard car bodies across Grand Boulevard for 80 years collapsed with no injuries, but with terrible symbolism. The last physical connection between the two halves of the factory, the bridge that had once been part of an assembly line producing some of the most magnificent automobiles in American history, fell into the street without ceremony. Today, the Packard complex is in the process of partial demolition. Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan called it a source of national embarrassment. The city has spent between $15 and $20 million on demolition. Money that is not rebuilding the factory, not preserving it, not transforming it, but simply erasing it. On December 1, 2025, the city unveiled a plan called Packard Park, proposing to transform a section of the former complex into a manufacturing facility and public space. Whether this plan will succeed where dozens of others have failed remains to be seen. The building that Albert Kahn designed in 1903 to be the most advanced factory in the world is ending its story as a demolition project. A national embarrassment, a cautionary tale. This is happening today, too, and nobody's learning from it. The Packard story is not ancient history. It is a blueprint for failure that is being followed, consciously or unconsciously, by brands, companies, athletes, and institutions in every era. The specific mechanisms change. The fundamental dynamic does not. Think about professional athletes who earn huge amounts of money during their careers and then watch it disappear. The research on this is striking. Studies suggest that about 78% of NFL players experience serious financial problems within 2 years after retiring. The pattern is usually the same. The income was real, the fame was real, and the lifestyle built around that success was real. Then the income stopped, but the lifestyle didn't. The expenses stayed, the identity stayed, and because their sense of who they were was tied so closely to luxury, spending, and public success, they couldn't scale things back, they couldn't adjust. They fell with the lifestyle they built, much like Packard did with its brand. Now, think about lottery winners. Research shows that many people who win large lottery prizes, $1 million or more, end up struggling financially within 5 to 7 years. The money arrives, and their lifestyle quickly grows to match it. But when the money runs out, the lifestyle doesn't shrink with it. The costs remain, the spending continues, and the identity, the belief that I'm a wealthy person now, becomes very hard to change without a deep personal crisis that most people aren't prepared to face. In many ways, this is what happened to Packard in 1935. The success of the cheaper models kept the company alive, but at the same time, it slowly weakened the brand itself. Consider what happened to BlackBerry. Once the definitive luxury status symbol of the corporate world, the device that presidents and CEOs carried as a mark of serious, high-powered identity. BlackBerry chose to protect its existing customers rather than cannibalize its own product line with touchscreen technology. And within a decade, the brand that had once defined executive prestige was irrelevant. The same thing happened to Kodak, an institution that literally invented digital photography and then refused to pursue it because it threatened their film business. The identity of what we are became more important than the question of what we need to become. This is Packard's story. This is the universal story. Here's what unites all of these examples. The fatal mistake is always the same. The identity precedes the strategy. Instead of asking, what does the market need and how can we provide it? The question becomes, how do we preserve what we are? Once that inversion happens, the institution is already in its final chapter, even if it doesn't know it yet. Packard knew it was in trouble. It knew its brand was eroding. It knew the Big Three had structural advantages it could not overcome, and it responded not with radical strategic transformation, but with a merger designed to preserve Packard as it was, rather than transform it into something that could survive. Display doesn't build legacy. Strategy builds legacy. Let's count what was lost. Let me give you the final numbers, because this is what the silence of the Packard factory actually represents. In 1928, Packard's last great year before the Depression, the company produced approximately 50,000 cars and held a brand value that was, by any contemporary measure, the equal of Rolls-Royce. That brand value, adjusted to today's dollars, was worth hundreds of millions of dollars in pure intangible equity. In 1956, the final year of real Packard production, the company had lost over $100 million in cumulative losses, over $1.1 billion today, since the Studebaker merger 2 years prior. The factory that had been built for $350,000 in 1903, roughly $12 million today, and had employed 40,000 workers was closed permanently, leaving 11,000 workers jobless in a single announcement. In 1994, when the city seized the property, the 3.5 million square foot complex was assessed at essentially zero. The tax obligations that triggered the seizure were a fraction of what the complex would have cost to demolish. In 2013, a full 55 years after the last Packard rolled off the assembly line, the most historically significant industrial site in the American luxury automobile industry sold at tax auction for $405,000, less than the price of a house. In 2019, 116 years after Albert Kahn designed the factory that changed industrial architecture forever, the Grand Boulevard Bridge that carried Packard car bodies over the street fell into the pavement. with a sound that nobody in Detroit was watching for. And just like that, it was gone. And here's what nobody talks about. The silence of the Packard factory is not the story of one company's failure. It is the story of what happens when identity replaces strategy, when reputation becomes a reason not to change rather than a foundation for change, when the fear of becoming something different is greater than the courage required to survive. Packard had everything: the brand, the engineering talent, the manufacturing infrastructure, the customer loyalty. It had the name, it had the factory, it had the slogan, and it traded all of it, piece by piece, decision by decision, for the comfort of familiarity and the illusion of continuity. It chose the merger that felt most like itself rather than the partnership that could have saved it. It chose the dealer network it recognized rather than the strategy it needed. And when the choices were exhausted, the factory went silent, and the silence was so complete that most Americans today don't know this story ever happened. That is the final lesson of the Packard factory. When you walk away from your identity to survive, you must have a new identity ready to replace it. And when you cling to your identity at the expense of survival, the identity outlasts you, but only as a ruin, only as something for urban explorers to photograph and graffiti artists to reclaim, only as a cautionary tale told in a YouTube video about a silent factory on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit. And nobody's talking about this because the lesson requires admitting that success contains the seeds of failure, that the very things that make a brand great, the obsession with quality, the commitment to a specific customer, the pride in what has been built, are the same things that make transformation difficult. And in a culture that celebrates success and has little patience for complexity, that truth is inconvenient. The Packard story doesn't have a villain. It doesn't have a simple moral. It has something harder, the recognition that excellence without adaptability is just a slow defeat.